Hello, it's me, Christine. Welcome to my little crime corner. Today, I'm going to tell you a story about how smoking saved someone's life. If, for whatever reason, you don't make it to the end of the video, I feel compelled to say smoking is bad. Please don't smoke. Okay, here we go. Today, our story takes place in Barberton, which is a small town in Ohio. 6-year-old Brooke Sutton was spending the night with her grandmother, Judy Johnson. It was notably very hot on the night of June 7th, 1998, and like many people in their small town, they left their windows and doors open. Judy Johnson left her front door open for the night, hoping to get a breeze through the house. Generally, Barberton was considered a safe area, and many people felt comfortable leaving their doors open at night. Unfortunately, tonight, something happened. Around midnight, Brooke woke up to some scary sounds coming from the kitchen. She walked into the kitchen only to find her grandmother being beaten by a man. Seeing this, she was, of course, scared, so she had run back to her room and hid under the covers. The man, startled by seeing her, chased after her, knocked her out, and assaulted her. Thinking she was dead, he left. When she regained consciousness several hours later, she walked out of her room to find her grandmother Judy on the living room floor, sadly dead. She then made an unimaginable phone call, one you hope to never hear or make. She called 911 to tell them that her grandmother had been killed. She told the 911 operator that she was all alone and she needed someone to call her mother and to please send someone. After she had made her call, she then went to the neighbor's house for help. Brooke was bloody and disheveled at this point, and part of her ear was missing. She was feeling very scared and alone. When the neighbor answered the door, she said that her kids were finishing up breakfast and getting ready for school, so she'd have to wait. Can you believe that? The neighbor made Brooke wait outside on the front steps for almost an hour. Like if a child in her state had come to your doorstep and told you what had happened, would you make her wait outside? No, you wouldn't, because you're a decent person. Anyway, after her kids were finished eating, she drove Brooke home. Later that day, Brooke was taken to the hospital where she was met by police, who asked her to give them a description of the man who was in her grandmother's house and who had done this to her. She had told police that she thought the man looked like her uncle. She said that he had dark hair and that he was tall. Mind you, Brooke is very young, and her description of the man is based on people she knew. Like, if you didn't know too many people, you might describe them in a comparative way to someone you know, and it may not necessarily be them. Police then went to visit her uncle, Clarence Elkins, for questioning. He lived about an hour away from Judy Johnson and had no reason to be in that part of town. He also had no criminal record, but that doesn't eliminate him as a suspect. In fact, he was the only suspect at this point, because that's who Brooke said it was or could be. Judy's daughter Melinda, who was Clarence's wife, said adamantly that he was innocent. She couldn't believe that Clarence would kill her mother. Despite all of this, Clarence Elkins was booked and taken into police custody. He maintained his innocence, but police did come up for a motive for why he might kill Judy. They had said that he hated Judy because she was interfering with his marriage to her daughter Melinda. They came up with this scenario because a woman who described herself as Judy's best friend had said that she overheard a phone call between Judy and Clarence where he had threatened to kill her just 1 week before the murder. Upon investigation, police found no physical evidence that Clarence had committed the crime or was even there. However, Brooke's testimony that it was in fact her uncle, Clarence Elkins, who had hurt her and her grandmother, is what solidified the jury's decision. Almost a full year later, on June 4th, 1999, Clarence was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 55 years in prison. Remember how no physical evidence had placed Clarence at the scene? On the same day as his sentencing, police had searched his car and home for anything. Fingerprints, hair, fibers, blood. But upon testing, they were unable to find a match. Melinda, Clarence's wife and Brooke's aunt, was sure Brooke was mistaken when she said it was Clarence who had killed her grandmother, because there was absolutely no way that Clarence could have done this or would have done this. 4 years later, when Brooke was 10 years old, she said she wasn't sure who or what she saw, but at this time, it was too late. She had already pointed out her uncle, Clarence Elkins, in court, and he was given his sentence. She really didn't think that it was her Uncle Clarence who had attacked her and her grandmother that night, and her Aunt Melinda had petitioned the courts for a new trial, since Clarence was only in prison in the first place by what they considered eyewitness testimony. Remember, there was no physical evidence. The petition was denied, and at this point, Melinda decided to take matters into her own hands. She knew that Clarence's DNA did not match any of the DNA or physical evidence found in her mother Judy's home, but it did belong to someone. She just had to find out who. She had made a list of all known criminal offenders living in and around the area and began looking into them one by one. She made lists of who her mother knew or who had access to her, and she knew that it could also be someone who she didn't know. Since her door was left unlocked that night, no one would have had to force their way in. She also contacted a man named Martin Yant, who had written a book called Presumed Guilty, and he was considered an expert in wrongful convictions. They worked together looking over case files and looked at the other witness testimony and came across something peculiar. Remember that woman that claimed she was Judy's best friend? And that she was present when Judy got that allegedly threatening phone call from Clarence? Well, she also said that she was there when Judy had called 911 to report the phone call to the police, but further investigation showed that there was no report filed by Judy, and they couldn't find any evidence that Judy even made that call. Suspicious. Like, who is this woman? During Judy's autopsy, a rape test kit was done and a swab was taken, but it was never tested for DNA. Melinda was able to get access to these swabs all these years later, and at her own expense, took it to a lab to analyze it. Lab technicians were able to test the swab and create a DNA profile, and surprise, surprise, just what Melinda had said all along. The DNA profile that they gathered did not match Clarence's DNA. So, where do we go from here? Again, Melinda had petitioned the courts for a new trial, and again, she was denied. We know that a DNA test of the swab was taken, and we know that Clarence's DNA does not match that taken of the swab, but the prosecutor's argument was, oh, the swab might have been contaminated, so the results may be unreliable. At this point, you might think Melinda is discouraged and feeling defeated, but you would be wrong. She is going harder than ever to prove that it wasn't Clarence, and she's like, I'll do you one better. Not only am I going to prove that it wasn't Clarence, I'm going to find out who it is. Do not mess with Melinda. She learned how to collect and preserve DNA while watching crime shows, and made her plan to solve the case. Remember that list she made of offenders in and around her mother's neighborhood? She went through that list and began going around, collecting what she could from each offender. Anything she could to get a sample of their DNA to then be tested, again, at her own expense. She would follow the people from the list and wait for them to leave behind a straw, a glass, a cigarette butt, anything. Bag it up, then move on to the next. When she had gathered up all of her samples, she then took them to a private lab and had each sample tested against the sample found on her mother. Unfortunately, none of the samples she had collected were a match, but Melinda didn't give up. Melinda never gives up. She was determined to free her husband Clarence, as well as get justice for her mother. Her investigations were halted until one morning. She saw an article in her local paper about a man who had been convicted for assaulting his 3 daughters. His name was Earl Mann, and when Melinda went to look him up on her computer to see what he looked like, she couldn't believe it. He looked so similar to Clarence. He was tall and he had dark hair. She knew why Brooke could have mistaken him for her uncle because, get this, remember the neighbor's house that Brooke had gone to after the attack to get help and they made her wait outside? Earl Mann lived there. And Melinda had a new lead suspect. Earl Mann was currently in jail, so Melinda wasn't able to follow him around to collect a straw or a cigarette butt like she had done with her previous suspects. But don't you worry, Melinda has a plan. Melinda always has a plan. She wrote Earl a letter in prison posing as a woman that wanted a pen pal, and she was hoping that he would write her back and she'd get his DNA off the envelope seal. Genius. He unfortunately did not write back. However, in a stroke of luck, Melinda discovered that Earl was not only in the same prison as her husband, but that his cell was pretty close to Clarence's. So Melinda filled Clarence in and told him her plan to get Earl Mann's DNA. Melinda told Clarence that he needed to follow Earl with a clean tissue in a bag at all times. He was instructed to collect a cigarette butt that Earl had smoked. This wouldn't be hard because luckily he smoked like a chimney. After several days of watching Earl, Clarence saw Earl smoking and leaving his cigarette butt in a clean, empty ashtray. His time had come. Clarence got up, retrieved the cigarette butt, and placed it carefully into the baggie that he had with him at all times, sealed the baggie, placed the baggie into his Bible to hide, and sent it to Melinda. Melinda, in turn, sent the cigarette butt to the lab, where it was tested against the DNA found on Melinda's mother during her autopsy. And guess whose DNA it matches? Earl Mann. Just like we expected. Unbelievably, and I really do mean unbelievably, the court had denied her motion for a new trial. Again, like ugh. So Melinda and her team went straight to the Attorney General for the state of Ohio, since they were getting literally nowhere with the local courts. Luckily, the Attorney General reviewed their case and believed that there had been an injustice, so he went straight to work. Because Earl Mann was a convicted felon, his DNA was already in the state's database, and if there was any question as to whether the DNA sample from Judy's autopsy had been tampered with in any way to give it a falsely positive match with Earl Mann's, they would be able to test it for themselves. Testing concluded that the sample taken off of Judy during her autopsy did in fact match the DNA they had on file for Earl Mann. Investigators think that Brooke was actually the target the night Earl Mann entered Judy's house, but Judy fought so hard to protect her, losing her life in the process. The physical evidence was so strong against him. Earl Mann had pled guilty to the rape and murder of Judy Johnson and was sentenced to 55 years in prison for his crime, which, in my opinion, is not enough. So, in December of 2005, Clarence Elkins walked out of jail a free man. Thanks, Melinda. You go, girl. And this pains me so much to say this, but the marriage between Clarence and Melinda did not last. And shortly after Clarence's release, they did get a divorce. The toll that it took on both of them for so many years and the stress of the roadblocks along the way were unfortunately just too much to overcome. There is no ill will between Melinda and Clarence. In fact, Melinda is working for the Ohio Innocence Project, hoping to continue to help the wrongfully convicted get justice. Clarence also does not blame Brooke or hold anything against her. I hope he is able to move on with his life after this whole crazy ordeal. I did find out, unfortunately, that in 2018, Brooke, along with her friend Ronald Delp, were indicted on 1 count of grand theft, which is a 4th-degree felony. She was accused of allegedly using identifying information that belonged to an acquaintance or relative to obtain additional library cards and other names in order to check out movies from libraries in Medina, Doylestown, Rittman, and Barberton, Ohio, totaling more than $15,000, and then reselling them to stores that bought back used DVDs. This ended up causing the library to change its rules regarding video checkouts. She had pleaded not guilty and ended up being released on bond. Was library fraud on your bingo card? Because it sure as heck wasn't on mine. Anyway, I hope she is doing much better. And that is the story of how smoking saved someone's life. Someone else smoking saved Clarence's life. It saved his life, but it won't save your life. Don't smoke. Smoking kills. And that is all I have for you today. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned something, and I will see you in the next one. Bye. I'm so dry.